If you're looking to reach the people actually shaping kids' media, we're opening up sponsorship for the Kids Media Club podcast, which gives you a direct line to senior decision makers across the industry. So, if that sounds like your kind of audience, you can reach us via kidsmediaclubpodcast.com or reach out to Emily, Andy, or myself, Joe, on LinkedIn. Hello and welcome along to another episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. I'm Joe Redfern.
I'm Emily Horgan, and Andy, we have a guest.
We do indeed. Louis Stowell is our guest today, the author of the hugely successful Loki books. Louis, great to have you on the show.
Great to be on the show. Yeah, I'm excited to chat about books.
Fabulous. So just get us started, will you have to give us a quick kind of introduction to the books you've written and a bit about Loki as well and kind of what makes that series special?
Yeah, so I've been writing books for a while. I started off writing non-fiction books for Usborne. So I've written about everything from space travel to ancient Egypt and insects, but then went on to writing fiction. I've written about a series called The Dragon in the Library, which is about a world in which all libraries have a sleeping dragon beneath it, and it is a librarian's duty to keep that dragon asleep and also to keep its dreams fed with stories, which is why you've got to read in a library, but it's also why you've got to be quite quiet in a library. Then I've written a book called Otherland about fairies, and by fairies I mean the real fairies, the ones that steal babies, not the nice ones. And so that's a sort of quest, a kind of comedy duo, bickering duo quest narrative. And then the Loki books, my most recent, I've been doing since 2022, and there are now 5 of them. So they're about the Norse god Loki's been sent to Earth as a punishment. He cut off a goddess called Sif's hair, which is obviously a very rude thing to do. And as a punishment, he was sent down to Earth in the form of a mortal child. And the punishment is partly because, you're an arrogant, all-powerful god. Suddenly you're, a helpless child. But also, I think for Loki specifically, he's very full of himself. So being forced to be in the child position in society is very humbling for him because suddenly he has a bedtime and homework and chores, which he does not take kindly to.
Things that gods like to do, really. Chores.
No, I mean, not me either, but I've always had to do chores, whereas if you suddenly have to, after thousands of years of your belongings never having to be picked up because they just pick themselves up magically, then it's a bit of a shock.
That's amazing. I love that you've written about a great many things too, because I bet you're great on a pub quiz team.
Yeah, though you have to catch me before I've forgotten it all, because I think I've forgotten my insects book by now.
Yeah.
But I can still tell you a lot about spaceships. So, got to keep that knowledge current. Because when I was writing nonfiction, there was always facts I couldn't get into the books. And the same goes for the Loki books, because I've done an immense amount of research. So, yeah, if there's a pub quiz about Vikings, I will win.
So these sounds like they're books for all ages, Louis, are they?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an age band, isn't there? There's always the suggestion that they're supposed to be what we call middle grade, so that's between roughly 8 and 12, but I mean, it can go younger and older depending on interest. And I think I did write them very much with a view to the family reading them together. So there are jokes in there for the adults, jokes for the kids, hopefully jokes for both of them at once, and lots of Easter eggs if you know a lot about Norse mythology, but also you don't need to know a lot going in. Sort of vaguely helps if you know that Odin exists and Thor exists and Loki exists, but other than that, you can go in pretty blank slate.
And how did you find the response to the books from the start? Do they catch on really quickly with audiences, with readers, or did you find were you surprised by the readers that the books attracted at all?
So it did catch on pretty quickly. I was very lucky because it was Waterstone's Book of the Month, which is like a big promotion. So I got to go all around the country to just about every Waterstones I could find, and meet a lot of kids from the start. But I think it was coming out just a couple of years after the pandemic. And I think everyone really was needing something a bit escapist. And it was, I think I deal with some quite serious stuff in it, but the overall tone is very light. So you're kind of, Loki's problems are quite small problems in some ways. They're, school and parents and friendships. But also I think the kind of format of it was part of what made it take off. Because it's very heavily illustrated. I illustrated myself in quite a scrappy style. So it's a very easy style to copy, I'd say. Get a lot of kids sort of sending me their own drawings of Loki and their own little comics. So it's a mix of, comics panels, text, doodles with that, sort of, it's an integrated thing. It's never like text, illustration, text, illustration. The illustration and the text works very closely together. And I think that appeals to both kids who kind of come from a very strong level of visual literacy. So kids who've come from comics, they really mesh with it. And also for kids who feel too much text is a bit much.
Yeah.
It also has a level of reassurance, I think.
That's interesting. That kind of taps onto something that I've always been struck by, that I sometimes think the key to a successful comic or animation is often that they're drawn in a style that the viewer or the fan feels like they could do their own approximation of, that they could.
Yeah, because I spent a lot of time as a kid.
Themselves.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so it kind of gives them ownership.
Yeah, I think the ownership is very important. And I think inviting complicity as well, because Loki is very much a voice that's saying, come here, I'm going to tell you all the very bad things I've done. And maybe you've done bad things too, but we can get better together. But yes, I spent a lot of time as a kid copying other people's styles. So I tried to draw Asterix so many times. And Asterix is actually quite hard to copy, I think, because it's a very particular style. I found Tintin much easier to copy, but I didn't like Tintin, so that was no fun.
I only got as far as Fido Dido, but he didn't have any books.
But Andy, you were asking about the kind of readers that it attracted. And actually there was a surprise in that. Because I think I had in mind, quite self-centeredly, someone a bit like me. So I thought it was going to be someone who's super like hardcore into mythology, nerds of that's particular kind of like obsessive hobby nerds. And then I do events and like it's football lads. It's just sort of kids who had no interest in mythology whatsoever, but they just, react to Loki's voice or they react to the jokes. So that was a really kind of interesting, I don't know, it was kind of a good moment for me to realize I had a lot of assumptions that I had not based on anything because, sorry.
Nice that it's kind of a reflection of its accessibility then, in the sense that you spoke about accessibility in how you can actually draw some of the illustrations. It's so complex that it locks you out from having a go yourself. And that's something that we speak about a lot on this podcast in relation to things like video games and this participatory relationship with media. Interesting that you've just spoken about that with something that is printed as a book, which I wouldn't have really thought about. But actually what you've just said is really you've created something that is very accessible, not just in its subject matter. Okay, it might be Norse mythology, but it's about a kid who might be a little bit bratty. We've all been bratty on occasion, but also created in an accessible way that is a mixture of text and illustration, but illustration that also feels like it's something, like you said, it can be replicated. I can participate in this as well. I think that's really interesting. And maybe that's the key to bringing kids back into books and reading, because I thought what was interesting when Andy shared some of the pre-notes to this call is about how, which makes me really sad, how reading for pleasure in free time is at rock bottom. Tell us about what you've noticed about that in your career as an author, and how do we go about fixing this thing?
So I think in a way, as an author, I don't get to see the problem because I go and talk to kids in schools, and those schools that get authors on board are already doing a, bang up job. They're really enthusiastic. They're probably quite well funded, realistically. And obviously, if I go to literary festivals, the kids who are going to literary festivals are not the kids who aren't reading. So I think in a way, I could probably live in a bit of a dream world about the situation with reading. So the stats then become very sobering. But actually, it's interesting, since the National Year of Reading is next year, and since that was announced, I've been asking a lot of friends who don't work in anything to do with books about reading. And a lot of them are saying, my kids don't read. And these are people with books in their houses and everything. But there is something that is changing. And I think as an author, I'm not necessarily seeing that. But as a human being with friends with kids, I am.
Yeah, it's kind of concerning. I guess the easy thing to do is to point to like mobile phones and gaming and digital experiences for that. Although there are, there's some also evolution of the art form because of those screens as well. I don't know.
I mean, I do think people have been making books much more of a visual feast since the rise of the digital. The kind of books as beautiful objects, but also just the level of design is incredible. I look at books I had as a kid in the 80s, and it's so much more basic. The graphic design is just not as sophisticated, whereas some of the stuff now is just, absolutely beautifully done. Not for a book that's supposed to be arty or anything, just every book. the level of design is so impressive. And I work very closely with the designer on Loki. He was, and together we're very much thinking with my editor as well about text balance and about kind of the level of illustration, but also thinking a lot about reading order, which is, quite boring and nerdy from a publishing perspective, but also so essential to a child's enjoyment, because if there's any confusion about where your eye should go next, that'll put them
Mm.
off. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes, some comics and some illustrated books do suffer from that. They suffer from that lack of clarity, because I think clarity has to come first and foremost, before anything else, before it being funny or interesting. You have to be able to tell what is going on.
Yeah, it's basically like a user interface.
Yeah.
And so sorry, I just wanted to kind of follow up on what you were saying about devices. So do you not think that there's a kind of an issue with competition with screens and mobile devices?
No, I absolutely do. And I think there's sort of two competitions. One's the kind of serotonin competition of you get much more kind of instant feedback from something that has little noises or, does something in reaction to you. So you're playing a game, obviously everything you do in that game, there's a reaction from the game. And in a book that doesn't happen. You don't get the book reacting to you. So I feel like the sort of serotonin you get from it is slightly more kind of slow release. So I do think there is that level of competition. I also think there's a level of trauma, because we are having, horrifying things live streamed into our lives at all moments. And I think that has got a lot worse since the pandemic, with everyone being online so much more. And I mean adults too.
Mm.
And I think being able to focus on and immerse yourselves in story isn't always easy when you're also being immersed in horrors. So I think there's all kinds of aspects that, no one group of people can solve, whether it, sort of not just screen time, but also how children are being exposed to what's happening in the world and how to navigate that. And I think part of the solution has to lie in how we adapt the books to suit the children's experience as they are now, and think about, who, how are kids experiencing the world? How are they experiencing story? And is there something we can learn from other media? Can we learn from cartoons? Can we learn from games? Both in what we put in the text, but also I think in terms of how we present stories. And I think I quite like the idea of being quite neutral about how stories should be accessed. So not
Right.
saying books are better than cartoons, not saying that physical books are better than audiobooks or ebooks, but just understanding that children will come to story in lots of ways. And it's my job as a writer to bring them to the kind of both the physical book and the audiobook, but also not tell them they're bad for enjoying other forms, because obviously I love other forms too. I love story in kind of every medium.
Absolutely. I mean, we ended up meeting briefly at the Booksellers Children's Conference, and I was on a panel talking about fandoms and how they related to books, and I think that's a kind of an interesting point, because there's something I think within children's media we've got used to, this idea that basically there are multiple touch points to how you can interact with a story or a universe. But I feel like kind of within publishing, that's still something where it's not necessarily kind of the immediate reaction to how people
Yeah,
should.
I think because you don't absolutely see book fandom among kids, but is entirely, or it's very hard for the publisher to engineer that, and it does tend to be entirely organic, because there's not really like fan conventions for books in the same way. I mean, there are for adults, but not really for kids. And I think the closest I've seen is the Phoenix comic, and they do this kind of big Phoenix Con. And it's I haven't actually been, but I've just seen kids' reactions to it, and it's it's like they're at the best pop concert ever, with the people they admire the much, and it's a group fandom, and I think I would love to see more of that in the book world generally. Thinking about how do you bring kids who love these things together, and how do you make it a party? How do you make it fun and interactive, and making sure it's sort of like it's watching people make comics who are professionals, but also giving the kids the tools to make their own. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think that kind of that fandom interactivity is really important. And I think is, an area we could definitely do more in.
I think that's really interesting. I like that idea, because the act of reading can be quite solitary, and in a way that's lovely on occasion. But when young people are fans of something, it becomes very much a social thing. You want to share it, you want to talk about it, you want to indulge that fandom together as a collective, and that's where that kind of those cons
Yeah.
would come to be. And I think that's really quite interesting, because it comes with joy, doesn't it? This is what you've spoken about, kind of the joy being squeezed out of reading. And actually, joy is something that is really important to kids, and that everybody should, they should experience joy. But then there's no reason that they can't experience joy through reading or through stories or through those characters. Do you think there is something structural that still maybe, because of reading or testing at school, that squeezes that joy out and has made it so very difficult for young kids to get into reading and love it?
I mean, I do think the testing element of reading is quite counter to joy. I feel like quite lucky in that when I was at junior school, it was the national curriculum came in when I was about 8, but I didn't have to undergo any testing at all because they only started testing the kids who'd been through the whole system. So I never had to do SATs or anything. And I do think, obviously not all kids hate tests and not all kids have their joy killed by tests. But I think the most you can do to remind people that story is books are entertainment. They're not something to be tested on. And yes, obviously school has to test you to a degree. But I see kind of individual teachers doing amazing work with this in terms of, they'll be creating little book clubs and, sort of like reading areas in the school and making much more of a game of it. And, obviously like all teachers and librarians are working incredibly hard within a system that they did not create. So none of this is on teachers. It is the systemic question. But again, I think I would definitely see my role as like prodding at the system. I can't necessarily change it, but hopefully I can kind of create a little wiggle room within it and encourage kids to question what they're being told about reading and sort of stick to their own guns a bit about what they like. Because part of the testing thing is very much kind of giving kids books that are supposed to be at their level. So the accelerated reader program and that kind of thing, where I've definitely had parent friends say that their kid wasn't allowed to take a book home because it was the wrong reading level.
Right.
Whether it was too easy or too hard. And again, that's probably not a blanket rule, but I think that kind of attitude to reading where it's about measurement and not about are you really into this?
I mean that just squeezes the complete joy out of the reading. I mean, I think I got into reading through comics, and I think part of that is that no adult was telling me that I should be reading comics. Quite the reverse, in fact. But it kind of meant that they were mine in a way that if your teacher tells you to read something, maybe it's just the contrarian in me, but instinctively as a kid, I would be less like.
Yeah, I think the more you can give kids power over what they're reading and a sense of agency, the more they will enjoy it. So that feeling of choice, but also rebellion. I read a lot of comics as a kid. It wasn't rebellion against my parents because my dad read them too, but I suppose there was a kind of illicit feel to it. So I loved this comic called Oink, which was satire for children, and it was very countercultural. And, while I liked the Beano, it was making fun of the Beano. And I think it's that sort of thing that, a bit like the fandom point, it lets you feel like you're part of something special and that you found a secret room in the world and it's only you and a few people.
And that's what's coming through for me in the conversation. It's like, that's connection, right? And digital platforms do offer connection, but also like you're talking about initiatives done by librarians, by teachers in schools to kind of connect reading clubs, the act of reading a comic book series, right? Like there's, by nature, there's going to be other people who are reading the comics with you, or you're swapping them around, or or like book series, that kind of thing, where you can swap them with your friends. And have you read that one? That all creates connection, which a lot of entertainment is actually about at its core.
Yeah, and so on the connection point, I was at the Speakeasy Award last night, which are the inaugural awards for audiobooks run by the Bookseller and then the Stage magazine, and quite a lot of the conversations were about that shared experience of listening. Whether it's listening in the car as a family or and it is a communal round the fire feeling.
Yeah.
Which I because I write about Vikings, they were not necessarily illiterate culture, but they were not a culture where literacy was the thing. They were an oral culture. And I think there's something very primal about that. And I think the ways that you share stories communally can be just literally swapping copies of your favorite book. But also, I know kids that will read their favorite bits out to their parents, and that makes it communal in a different way. Or just the act of reading to a child. Obviously, that is community in itself.
It's interesting. It's making me reflect on my two kids who are both readers, but in very different ways.
Mm.
One hoovered up novels, would think nothing of picking up a tome and wasn't put off by it, whereas the other one was very much a magazine reader, a football magazine reader, because he loved football, but he also loved stats. And he liked memorizing tables and bits of history. You know, this thing happened in this cup final in 1999. And it was just very different ways of reading, no less valid, but just different ways of processing information and taking it on board and enjoying it. And I mean, it's really fascinating how it can mean so many different things to different kids. I want to just dig into this kind of sharing of stories as well, because again, thinking back to mine, we never missed a bedtime story. It was part of, and I used to work, so it was part of me connecting when I got home from work with the kids, was sitting and reading stories, and we had the audio versions in the car and things. Is there an issue with the level of literacy amongst new parents now themselves who are perhaps not confident readers that might impact?
I don't know about literacy per se, but I definitely think the confidence is lacking. And I think a lot of people worry about the performance level, like they worry it's not going to be like the best possible reading of something. And also, obviously, like new parents are very tired. So I think, again, something that the publishing industry can do with that thing is make sure it reads well aloud when you're writing a picture book. That should be a basic, but it's not always. And I've got friends who are picture book writers, and their mission in life is to say, you can read this easily aloud, even though you've had no sleep for a week. And, it naturally trips off the tongue. Also, you're going to have to read it 400 times.
Yeah.
So I think there's always things that you can do as a writer or as a publisher to make that experience easier. And I'm sure there's, greater societal things we can do. I feel like, sort of if there could be more like after school story clubs where parents can come and like listen to someone else read to their kids, but also pick up some tips. I went to because I've done a couple of picture books, and one of the things I did was with the Stratford Literary Festival, where they go into local schools and they have pajama parties. So I went to some random school at like 3:30, and all the kids were in their pajamas and the parents were there. And I read to them, but then they made up their own characters as well. And again, that was a community experience, but it was also, them seeing me read the book and realizing I wasn't reading it that great. And I'm the author. I just reading it normally. I didn't do a lot of voices or anything. So yeah, I think there's lots that can be done for parental confidence, and also just there's the access question as well, like making sure books are available in a wide range of places, because, not everyone's got a Waterstones anywhere near them, nor would they necessarily want to go to one. There are books in supermarkets, but it tends to be a very narrow range. Then you've got shops like The Works springing up, but also I think here the loss of libraries, like so many libraries closing down, is a big part of this as well.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I was reading on the library front. I think I was reading that the government's got a commitment to introduce libraries into more schools now as well.
Yeah, so that's as part of the National Year of Reading. And so there's funding for books for schools. And it's essential because, if the kids, let's say, most schools will probably have some books, but they might be really old and raggedy and not the books that the kids really want. So it's not going to appeal to them. So having that kind of funding injection is vital. But I hope it will continue beyond the Year of Reading, because obviously it's great that they're putting the money in now, but next year too, and next year,
Right. Yeah. So the Year of Reading is kind of, it's a commitment for that year, but it doesn't.
I think there was a commitment though actually for a library in every primary school by the end of the Parliament. So
okay,
there's that too.
Great.
So I will be watching and judging.
And what other things, like what themes do you think would be good to bring into books that will make kids connect more with reading? Is it different types of characters? Is it like a variety of, obviously like we talked even before about magazines versus novels, right? It doesn't have to be one format.
So I think what you said, Joe, earlier about different modes of reading and how some kids read just to learn facts. I think it's, there's actually, there's incredible nonfiction publishing, but I suppose, so this is more about making sure we present these books to kids rather than the fact that they're not being published. They are being published. And valuing that mode of reading, because I think reading just like some kids love to read in a deep immersion way and their entire mind is full of the story. But some kids literally, they're just trying to find stuff out. And that is, as you say, just as important. I've been using an expression, reading for spite, which is basically when I want to read something non-fictional to prove someone wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're wrong about that. I'm going to go and read this. And I do think kind of reading to prove that you know more is quite a fun thing as a kid.
Yeah.
And I can remember, like vividly remember times from childhood when I was absolutely convinced I was right, but I didn't have the text to back it up. So if I'd been able to go and get the right book, I would have proved it. But I mean, in terms of themes, I think, obviously I'm biased in this, but I think there's never enough funny books, always more funny books, and also more anarchy. That's the thing I always want more of. And I think,
Does anarchy mean more fart jokes?
not necessarily, no. I think it also means more questioning of authority, more characters who are not deeply pleasant. So, you know, unheroic heroes, because that's much more relatable. You know, like not many kids are the perfect child who do the right thing and are noble and brave all the time. You know, give me a coward who makes mistakes, who will run away from battle and also probably hurt people, because I think as a child, you're so aware of your own failings that actually a character with a lot of failings can be very appealing. Obviously, I love fart jokes, but I also like jokes about the nature of power and jokes about why are adults in charge? Who put them in charge? They're not very good at it, you know. And I think anything that allows children to kind of have their own anger validated as well, which I think I loved. I always loved Just William as a kid. I'm not saying it's like the most anarchic thing in the world. It's probably quite conservative, but it did sort of point out the injustice of how children's lives are, you know, kind of controlled. At least you feel William's sense of that injustice.
Yeah.
And then Jan Mark was very good at that. She was writing in the, I think, 70s, but I read her in the 80s. And she often had children who were kind of in conflict with authority. Because I just think, however, you know, even if you're a very well-behaved child, there's always a sense that you are not the one with the power and a resentment about that. So I think children's fantasy often plays with that. So it's a power fantasy. It's, you know, suddenly I am the center stage. You know, the parents have been killed. I'm an orphan, you know, or I'm in another land where magically people take children seriously, you know. And so I do think that's what I mean by anarchy. I think Saturnalia. It's turning the power relationships upside down and in a way that feeds into what children want and need.
And do you feel like, is there enough of an appetite for that kind of storytelling with publishers, or do you feel like because one of the things we talk about a lot within kids media as a whole is that for some of the established broadcasters, sometimes there's a sense that there's a bit of risk aversion, or that they can't really necessarily take kind of big bets on something that's original.
Sometimes,
yeah, I mean, I think like publishing loves to take big bets, but you know, massive financial investments in something, you know, with no proven track record. However, I do think there can be risk aversion in terms of like, this is how a book is published often is you as the editor will want to buy a manuscript and you think, this is the best story ever. I'm going to take it to acquisitions, which is the meeting where it gets decided whether it's published or not. And in order to do that, you have to come up with what's called comp titles. So basically titles for the sales team to use as a benchmark of how much this book might sell. You know, it's a bit like this book, so it might sell a bit like this book. And I think that structure can inhibit truly new weird stuff coming through. And the truly new weird stuff comes through in spite of that system. And I think sometimes an editor will just argue for something and people will get on board with it, even if there's nothing like it out there. But it is quite hard to, I remember, you know, as a publisher, pitching books and being like, well, it's not really like anything. And that's the point. It's something new. You know, there's not anything like it now, or at least there hasn't been anything like it for 50 years. You know, you're kind of bringing back something from the past. So I think there is something in the system that is fundamentally risk averse in that particular way. So what it takes is kind of individual personalities bashing through that and taking a leap in the dark.
And do you think the publishing world is open to being inspired by stuff that's happening outside of publishing? So, for instance, something that's been a big hit within kids media, or kind of slightly older than kids media, is K-pop Demon Hunters, which we've talked about a couple of times.
Yeah, interestingly,
podcast. But would that be something that book publisher would say, that's great, we should do something that connects to that audience.
Yes, but I'm not sure it works. So because K-pop Demon Hunters works because of the music. It's not the
Agreed.
fact that it's about K-pop. It's the fact that there's real music. And I think because people have been doing K-pop books for quite a while now. I mean, not quite, been like 5 years now. But I think none of them have been massive because they're not actually by K-pop stars and there's no music. And I think sometimes you can't copy from one medium to another. However, you could use that, you can use those points of reference to kind of get kids excited about things. But I do think, while you can definitely learn trends from elsewhere, and I think they're often wider societal trends that you learn from rather than like one particular property. Like, let's say we are now in a phase of cozy crime, which is quite broad.
Mm.
And that sort of, exists within kids as well. Quite often it's sort of adult publishing trends will filter down. But I think, yes, sometimes it's knowing what to pull from the other media. Because I think there's a lot of kind of computer games where I think you can really pull on those themes and say, why are kids drawn to this particular game? And then understand how do you translate that into another media.
Yeah. It's that world building opportunity as well. I actually feel like gaming and publishing do have that in common, that the world can be expansive and vast, and the characters there can be multiple, like endless, but very many characters. I think about something like Warrior Cats. The way Warrior Cats has gone from being a novel to over to being a really successful game. It's trying to kind of understand where, like, I think you put it well, Nui, to say like where it maps and where it doesn't.
I think you're so right about world building though, because I think often the kids' stories that do really well are ones where the child can project themselves into that world.
Yeah.
Whether it's a very simple world like Bunny versus Monkey and they project themselves by creating their own adventures, or something more kind of fantastical where you're thinking, oh, I want that magic power, or like Warrior Cats where you're like, I'm this type of cat. And yeah, I think the immersive nature of it and that feeling of like this, if I turned my head, this story would still be there over there. It would still exist behind me.
Yes.
And that's, something I'm always trying to do is having that sense of this story could go on infinitely. You could write your own versions of it. These characters could kind of, interact and clash in so many different permutations.
That does reflect that kind of sandbox element of gaming, doesn't it? I never thought about it in that book context before.
That's where fanfic comes in. Obviously, that is the ultimate sandbox.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's in your career, in your experience, what's one of the things that really strikes you as, oh my gosh, that was just a piece of genius that got kids into reading, or, was something that stands out as a moment to you where something flipped, something changed?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I do feel like Dogman was a bit of a
Yeah.
I want to say high watermark. That's the wrong thing. It was the tide was turning then, and I think that was the first in the UK media anyway. I mean, America are way ahead of us, but I think that was the first comic that was published by a children's book publisher, not a comics publisher, that had that kind of mass breakout. And again, it was very silly, but it's also very clever. And I think you underestimate children at your peril. And if you think Dogman is good just because it has like silly jokes, it's not just that. It is saying something
real heart to it.
It's quite meta, and it is actually engaging with children, assuming they have a certain understanding of story and what story can do and the limits of story. There'll be jokes about like trademarking in it and stuff, and sort of fourth wall breaking. And I think it's that combination of simplicity and sophistication that I think made Dogman so great. And I think it took a while for publishing to really catch up with comics because it's so expensive to make them. So the risk just that much greater. And it's slow as well. Like you could write a book that's text only in whatever, you could probably, if you wanted to kill your author, you could do it from start to finish in 6 months. But a comic, you really can't. And it means that you don't see it, let's say, even if this book is going to sell, you're not going to see a return on your investment for more than your budget period. And I remember like from, being in publishing, you were often like forecasting just for a year. And for a lot like color publishing, you're not making your money back for 3 years, but that's not reflected in the spreadsheet. So no one will believe in it, especially things where you need to sell foreign rights to make it worthwhile. And I do think the publishing industry is pretty good at looking at other countries and seeing what they're doing. And there's some things that you can't really learn from, say like manga. I think people are doing a lot of manga style comics, but at the same time, they're still not manga because they're not from Japan,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's, children don't want an inauthentic copy of something. But I think they do things like the visual language of manga has really kind of filtered into UK comics now. And a lot of whenever I see kids, so I'll do a lot of, Loki events in schools and I'll show them how to draw Loki. And there's always one year 6 who draws him as a manga character. Like they've just kind of adopted some of those styles. Like the hair is slightly more kind of
Yeah.
gelled and the eyes are bigger, nose is smaller. And I don't know if they're even consciously trying to draw in a manga style. It's just in the water now,
I mean, that's something you could really see where that audience was really looking to kind of learn how to draw in that style. The amount of YouTube tutorials on being able to draw a manga character,
Yeah.
they just kind of infused that style, I think, and
Yeah.
so it just came out on any of their drawings.
Yeah. And it's amazing because are such amazing learn to draw resources with manga that it is, it's educating a generation online for free.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that when you're looking at creating a book, is the idea of where that might exist in different media kind of something that you're thinking about at the start, or is that encouraged more within publishing now to kind of think about something as a kind of property that would exist in different media
As a
spaces?
writer, no, but I think as a publisher, yes, absolutely. And so my wife works in publishing as well, and she's in the kind of film and TV side. So she'll be working, with authors selling their rights onto companies. And I do think acquisitions meetings now are like, so is there film and TV potential for this?
Yeah.
And it's not going to be for everything, and especially things that are too British. I feel like there's often things where like this is not going to work in any other country, and it's fine. It works really well here, but be incomprehensible to any other culture but Britain. But I think it's in the publishing discussion. But I think as a writer, you could probably drive yourself a bit mad trying to think like that, because when you try to think in too businessy a way as a creative, I think it just kills whatever you're making. And it's much better to think, what is this idea? How do I want to express it? Where it goes later is someone else's problem. But I just want to make something that has legs for me that I think I could keep doing. So I started off with Loki thinking I wanted to do my 9 books because I've always thought 9 books for the 9 realms of the Norse myths, and I'd always had the arc in mind. And I can definitely see how that arc would translate across different media. And it's quite interesting thinking about adapting things. Like, let's say I was doing a play of Loki. Would I just pick one of the books to adapt? Would I combine elements of them? And I think thinking, does a story have the elasticity and depth to stretch and to transform into other media? That's often just a sign of a good story, that story has enough to it that if you changed it, it would still remain itself.
Yeah. And I think that's really good advice for any medium. Like it has to work as a story first with the characters and everything like that.
Yeah.
before it's-
And you have to be excited about it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
because I was doing a new short story within the Loki universe, and I was like, it was one of those ideas where it's like, is this a really ridiculous idea? I don't care, I'm having fun. And I think that's often the way you write something good is having such a good time doing it, and you're thinking, and I think if you have that slight fear that you're doing something insane, you're probably doing something right.
Yeah. But also
Yeah.
you're probably the biggest fan of your own characters, right? So if they're making you laugh, you know what I mean? Like that
Yeah, you know them best.
Yeah. Any tips for getting kids into reading? Is there anything that
So I
you've
think
seen-
availability is obviously first and foremost. Give kids a range of things. Don't just say this is the thing you must read, and give kids agency. So let kids feel like they have the power to choose what they want to read. I've written this thing called the Loki Festo, which is a poster basically, but it's a series of provocations about reading. The idea being to get kids to sort of question what they're told about reading. So it's basically Loki giving them a load of reading tips, but they're sort of anti-tips in a way.
What would be the top 3 of those reading tips that he might?
So I think one of them is read with your ears. So it's about audiobooks. And I've illustrated each one of the points. And it's got a picture of Vikings saying, because obviously Vikings exist in an oral culture. Come over here and tell me this isn't a story, So I feel like Vikings menacing you into reading. And then there's I mean, this is more the overall message of the Loki Festo, but it's basically stepping away from judgment.
Mm.
This is much more of an advice to adults than kids, which is do not judge what a child is reading. Do not tell them it's too young for them. Do not tell them comics aren't proper books. Basically just don't.
Yeah.
And
But it also pre-arms young readers that they don't then feel embarrassed about reading, because you're kind of giving the arguments for them that they can read whatever they want.
yeah, exactly. I'm like, Loki says you can, so
Yeah.
don't care what your teacher says. And no, obviously, I've had the odd teacher push back on it. It's like, I don't mean any of this literally. I don't think you should hurl books across the room if you don't like them. But having the feeling within you that you could is a kind of power. And I think, like I've said, children have so little power in their lives. Give them what you can, and let them experiment. I think that feeling of reading is an experiment, and sometimes you're not going to like a book, so you know what, it's fun to stop if you don't. I mean, unless you're reading it for school or something, but like if it's reading for fun, just stop reading it if you're not enjoying it. And I had to learn that lesson as an adult, and I've only recently been able to stop reading books I'm not enjoying, because I feel guilty. I feel like, oh, I've finished it, I've started it now.
It's so true.
But actually, why? There's so many books out there that you're wasting precious time,
Mm.
And I think in terms of how you can support children to read, as an adult, read in front of them. I think that's something that people sort of forget about, is that there is a literal kind of role modeling of reading. And a lot of parents are like, why are my kids reading, as they sit on their phone? And just remembering that they would, and I think it made a big difference that I saw my parents reading. I think of my dad's face like this, because he was quite short-sighted, so he'd be like reading like that. So that's
For the benefit of podcast listeners, Louise held her hand right in front of her face.
Oh yeah, sorry, not a visual medium. I had my hands in my face, like it's a book. But yeah, and I obviously think book banning is hideous, but pretending you disapprove of a book is quite useful, because I think sometimes making something seem a little bit illicit is quite fun.
Yes, that reverse psychology, for sure.
Yeah. Obviously, you've got to be pretty good at it and smart that the kid doesn't notice that you're doing it.
There's one interesting. So on Minecraft, there is something called the Infinite Library, and someone has built a library in Minecraft where you can go in, and there are some texts that have been banned that have been recreated in Minecraft, which I think, again,
amazing.
A bit of subversion. If it's in Minecraft, it's likely to have been created by a developer who's relatively young.
Yeah,
yeah. Very hard to take books out of a Minecraft built library. So there's things like that sometimes pop up on my radar, and I think, yes,
that is great. That's very inspiring, actually.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And sorry, one of the other things about helping kids read, one of the ongoing projects in publishing has been to try and make publishing more inclusive. And I think that feeling of like having texts that children can relate to from whatever background, from whatever, particular niche of the human experience they have. So making sure there's a wide range of representation of disability, of different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. And I think, it's something where there's definitely been some progress made, but always further to go. Because I think the first sort of the temptation with representation is to do it in a worthy way. And children can smell that. So I read a great book recently called The Cheap Book by a guy who started in comics, actually, called Ramsey. And he very much wanted to do a book about the refugee experience, which was his family's experience, that was a really funny, stupid story. And I think that's the representation that I love, especially, where it is understanding that you may have this particular set of experiences, but what you like reading about is not misery. It is kids being weird, or, in the case of this book, The Cheap Book, it's about a kid who finds this magic book that allows him to cheat at school. So it like magically makes him popular and, wins. I mean, he learns a valuable lesson that you shouldn't cheat, mostly. But yeah, I think having that kind of real range of, people writing from their own experience, people writing in a way that reflects the world around you,
Amazing. Thank you. Really inspiring. It's made me think I need to go and read a book.
Or a magazine or a comic,
Well,
Yes.
come to realize that I am more of a magazine and comic person, whereas my husband will sit and read a book.
I mean, I love reading books, but I also love reading like long read articles online, you know? I've got quite into the FT recently. I'm not going to suggest that for kids, though.
Not yet.
That's great.
Amazing.
Thanks very much for that, Louis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to do the sign off? You did so well.
Yeah, I'll do a quick sign off.
Little
So
out.
thanks again, Louis, for that fascinating chat. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And please like and subscribe and listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you next time.